She stepped onto the witness stand in wrinkled clothes, her weary posture prompting a colonel to sneer. This is a courtroom, not a diary booth. When Marissa bowed her head and answered too softly, the judge slammed the gavel. Speak up, you think? A whisper is enough. The room erupted in laughter. Some officers shook their heads. Probably just another logistics girl trying to look important. But what if her whisper held a secret that could silence them all? Stay tuned to Thread Tales to find out. The moment she whispered 4 syllables, Vox Delta 90, the air snapped. Still, an emergency signal was dispatched and the central system began to flash. Voice confirmed. The laughter died like someone flipped a switch. 2 security officers in the back, both in crisp uniforms with earpieces dangling, exchanged a look. One fumbled for his encrypted phone, his fingers shaking as he punched in a code. The other stepped back, his boots squeaking on the polished floor, and whispered something to his partner. The judge, a gray-haired man with a face like weathered stone, leaned forward, his glasses slipping down his nose. What did you just say? He asked, his voice slower now, like he was tasting each word. Marissa stood there, her hands clasped in front of her old gray skirt, her pale skin almost glowing under the courtroom lights. She didn't flinch. I just triggered an Alpha Sun Troll directive, she said, calm as if she were reading a grocery list. The verification system will respond within 60 seconds. Can one woman's words really stop an entire operation? Keep watching Thread Tales to uncover the truth. A clerk in a faded blazer, his tie slightly crooked, stood near the evidence table, sorting papers with a bored expression. He glanced at Marissa, then snorted loudly enough for the front row to hear. She's playing spy games, he muttered too. A nearby aide, his voice dripping with mockery, wrinkled clothes, no makeup. Bet she's just some desk jockey who overheard a code once. The aide, a young woman with sharp red nails and a smug grin, nodded and whispered back. Probably thinks. She's in a movie. Their words carried, and a few officers chuckled, their eyes flicking to Marissa's hunched shoulders. She didn't turn. Instead, she adjusted her skirt, her fingers brushing the frayed hem, and stood a little straighter, her gaze fixed on the flickering screen. The clerk's smirk faltered when he noticed her steady hands, but he shook it off, tossing another file onto the pile. The room stayed quiet, too quiet. A young soldier in the corner, barely old enough to shave, shifted in his seat, his eyes darting to the older officers. He leaned toward the guy next to him, a lanky private with a nervous tic, and muttered, "What's she talking about? Key. Archive? Sounds like some made-up nonsense." The private nodded, but his smirk faded when he saw the colonel's face. The colonel, a barrel-chested man with a chest full of medals, wasn't laughing anymore. His jaw tightened. He stared at Marissa like she'd just pulled a pin from a grenade. The screen on the wall, massive monitor that had been showing case files, flickered. A single line of text appeared. Code verification in process. Room felt like it was holding its breath. Marissa didn't move. She didn't look at the screen or the judge or the officers whispering in the back. She just stood there, her slender frame slightly hunched, her loose black hair falling over one shoulder. The wrinkles in her blouse seemed to scream that she didn't belong here, that she was out of place among the starched uniforms and polished briefcases. But her eyes, those dark, tired eyes, held something else. Not fear, not anger, just certainty. Like she knew something the rest of them didn't. The judge cleared his throat, trying to take back control. "Young lady," he said, his voice sharp. This is a serious proceeding. You can't just walk in here and throw out random codes." A stenographer, her hair streaked with gray and her fingers poised over her machine, let out a sharp sigh. "This is a waste of time," she said under her breath, loud enough for the front row to catch. "She's stalling. Look at her. She can barely stand up straight." A few officers nodded, their lips curling into smirks. One, a major with a slick haircut and a gold watch, leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Bet she's got nothing but stories from some old base job." Marissa's fingers twitched at her side, but she didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulling out a small, crumpled photo of a desert base at sunset. its edges worn from years of handling. She glanced at it for a split second, before tucking it away, her face unreadable, but her shoulders tensing just enough to notice. Before he could finish, the screen flashed red. A new message appeared, voice confirmed. Protected entity, do not interrogate. The words hit the room like a shockwave. Officers stood up, chairs scraping against the floor. A female captain, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, yanked out her headset and tossed it on the table. "That's impossible," she muttered, her voice loud enough to carry. The legal recorder, a nervous woman with glasses too big for her face, started frantically tapping at her keyboard, erasing the transcript line by line. A major in the front row, his face red from too many years of stress, stammered, "That's a national verification voice, the kind you're not allowed to record." All charges against Marissa were marked indefinitely suspended on the screen. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just said, "I told you I'm only authorized to speak when permitted. Hey, before we go on, can you do Thread Tales a quick favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to keep sharing stories like this. Stories about people who've been through the fire and come out stronger. It's just a small way to stay connected, to keep walking this journey together." All right, let's get back to Marissa. The colonel wasn't done. He leaned forward, his metals clinking against the table, and snapped. "You think 4 words can save you from charges of destroying classified files?" His voice dripped with contempt, like he was talking to a child caught lying. A congressman, sitting in the observation gallery, a man in a tailored suit with a fake tan and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, slammed his fist on the table. "We have the authority to detain you for obstructing trial procedures," he said, his voice loud enough to make the young soldier jump. The female captain, the one with the tight bun, scoffed. "Probably read some old report and now wants to be famous," she said, rolling her eyes. The room murmured in agreement, a low hum of judgment. An older officer, his uniform sagging from years of wear, stood up and pointed at Marissa. "You're nobody," he said, his voice rough with indignation. "No clearance, no record, just a ghost from some forgotten base." His words stung, and a few others nodded, their faces hardening. The stenographer smirked, her fingers tapping faster, as if she couldn't wait to record this takedown. Marissa's lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, she tilted her head, slightly, her eyes locking onto the officers. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink, her gaze cutting through the noise. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than his accusation, and the officer sat down, his face flushed, his hands fumbling with his pen. Marissa didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or try to defend herself. She just stepped back, her worn-out shoes silent on the floor, placed her hand to her forehead, like she was shielding her eyes from the sun. It wasn't a salute. It wasn't a gesture anyone in the room recognized, but it felt deliberate, like a signal to someone or something far beyond the courtroom. The screen flickered again. The words "code verification in process" pulsed in bold letters. The congressman's face went pale. He loosened his tie, his fingers fumbling. The captain stopped smirking. The colonel's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say another word. Marissa stood there, her hand still at her forehead, waiting. In the back of the room, a civilian contractor, in a cheap suit, leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "She's bluffing," he said to the aide next to him, loud enough for half the room to hear. "I've seen her type, some low-level clerk who thinks she's special undid because she filed papers at a base." The aide laughed, a sharp cutting sound, and added, "Look at that skirt. She's got no business here." A few heads turned, their eyes raking over Marissa's plain clothes. She didn't react, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, the leather worn thin from years of use. Slowly, she set the bag on the floor, her movements precise and straightened up, her posture no longer hunched. The contractor's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as he caught the shift in her demeanor. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Clerk in the back, a skinny guy with a bad haircut, dropped his pen, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. Nobody laughed this time. The young soldier whispered to the private again. What's happening? Is she for real? The private didn't answer. He just stared at the screen, his mouth half open. Then the screen turned red again. A new notification appeared. Voice confirmed. Detected entity. Do not interrogate. The words seemed to burn into the room. The colonel sat back, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The captain's headset lay abandoned, its cord tangled. On the floor, Marissa lowered her hand and said, I told you I'm only authorized to speak when permitted. An officer, his face still boyish despite his rank, stood up, his voice shaking with frustration. This is a circus, he said, his hands clenched into fists. She's turning this court into a joke. His words sparked a ripple of agreement, and the stenographer nodded, her glasses glinting as she leaned forward. No respect for procedure, she muttered, her fingers flying across her machine. Marissa's eyes flicked to the officer, then away, landing on a small crack in the courtroom floor. She bent down, as if to adjust her shoe, and her fingers brushed the floor, lingering on the crack for just a moment.
Ow.
It was a tiny gesture, but it silenced the officer. He sat down, his face red as if he'd been caught shouting at a ghost. The room shifted. Officers who had been slouching sat up straight. The legal recorder stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keyboard like she was afraid to touch it. The congressman muttered something under his breath, but nobody caught it. The judge looked at Marissa, his gavel forgotten in his hand. What are you? He asked, his voice quieter now, almost respectful. Marissa didn't answer. She just stood. There, her tired eyes scanning the room, taking in every face, every uniform, every whisper. She didn't need to say anything. The screen had said it for her, but they weren't done with her yet. A panel member, a wiry man with a buzzcat and a voice like gravel, leaned forward. Say another code, he challenged, his eyes glinting with suspicion, or is that the only trick you know? The room stirred again, like a dog shaking off water. Whispers rose, sharper now, accusing her of staging the whole thing to dodge accountability. No rank badge, no payroll record, a lieutenant muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Nothing but a weak voice. The captain nodded, her lips curling into a smirk again. If she's really comes clearance, let's see it, she said. Crossing her arms, a reporter in the gallery, her notebook open and her pen poised, couldn't resist. This is going nowhere, she said loudly, her voice sharp with impatience. She's wasting everyone's time with this act. No wonder she's got no lawyer. She's got nothing to say. The words cut through the room, and a few officers clapped, their hands smacking together like a challenge. Marissa's head tilted slightly, her eyes meeting the reporter's for a brief moment. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, tarnished keychain with a single charm, a faded star. She held it in her palm, her thumb brushing over it, and the reporter's clapping stopped, her pen frozen in midair. Marissa didn't flinch. She stepped toward the evidence table, her movement slow and deliberate, like she was walking through water. The table was cluttered with files, folders, and a single silver envelope, triple sealed with red wax. She picked it up, her fingers steady, and walked to the judge's bench. The room watched, every eye locked on her. She placed the envelope in front of the judge and whispered Level 3 response code Phoenix Echo Theta. Her voice was so soft it barely carried, but it didn't need to. The words landed like a stone in still water.
Are wave-like ripples spreading through the room?
The judge hesitated, his hand hovering over the envelope. He broke the seals one by one, the wax cracking under his fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its edges worn, but its text clear. He read it, his eyes widening, his mouth opening slightly. This is a directive only the Supreme Commander can issue, he said, his voice shaking. The colonel stood up, his chair scraping loudly. She had the power to suspend an entire operation, he asked, his voice breaking. The envelope bore the insignia. The Key Voice program disbanded 7 years ago, or so they thought, Marissa whispered. That directive reactivates only when I vocalize the code at the correct frequency. Outside, sirens wailed. Operation Red Desert, a multi-billion-dollar military initiative, had just been terminated. A technician in the corner, his laptop open and his glasses fogged from stress, slammed his hands on the table. "She's hacked the system," he shouted, his voice high and frantic. "Nobody has that kind of access anymore, not since the program shut down." His accusations sparked a wave of murmurs, and the major with the gold watch nodded vigorously. "She's a fraud," he said, pointing at Marissa. "She's playing us all." Marissa didn't blink. She turned slightly, her eyes catching the technician's, and slowly folded her hands in front of her, her fingers interlaced. The gesture was so calm, so deliberate, that the technician's shouting faltered, his hands dropping to his sides as the sirens outside grew louder. The room erupted in chaos. Officers shouted over each other, demanding answers. The congressman was on his phone, his voice low and urgent. The captain's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure shock. The young soldier in the corner looked like he might cry. "Stopped it?" he whispered to the private. "She stopped the whole thing?" The private didn't answer. He just stared at Marissa, his hands clenched into fists. The judge held up the paper, his hands trembling. "This bears the Joint Command signature," he said, his voice barely audible. How? How do you have this?" Marissa didn't answer. She didn't need to. The sirens outside grew louder, their wail cutting through the courtroom walls. The screen flickered again, displaying a new message. "Operation Red Desert terminated. All personnel stand by for debrief." The room went silent again, but this time, it wasn't shock. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes when you realize you've misjudged someone badly. Marissa stepped back from the judge's bench, her hands clasped in front of her again, her face calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just waited. The female captain couldn't take it anymore. She stood up, her chair clattering too. "The floor? If you're that powerful," she snapped, her voice shaking with anger, "why live in hiding? Why let yourself be summoned like an ordinary citizen?" Her words were sharp, but there was a crack in them, like she was trying to convince herself. The room turned to Marissa, waiting for her to falter. She didn't. She looked at the captain, her tired eyes steady, and said, "Because you forgot. I existed." The words hung in the air, simple and heavy. The captain opened her mouth, then closed it. Her face flushed, a security guard near the door, his badge glinting under the lights, stepped forward, his voice booming. "Enough of this," he said, his hand resting on his holster. "You're not walking out of here with some magic words?" His tone was thick with disdain, and a few officers nodded, their faces hard. "She's no operative," he added, pointing at her wrinkled blouse. "Look at her. She's nobody." Marissa's eyes flicked to his badge, then back to his face. She took a single step toward him, her movements slow, and reached into her bag. She pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth, a faded patch with a star emblem. She held it up, just high enough for him to see, and his hand froze on his holster, its bravado draining away. Marissa's voice stayed soft, but it carried. "I left the system to protect memories, not to be honored," she said. "But if you dare to question me, then face the consequences of what I remember." She stepped to the microphone one last time, her hand steady as she leaned forward. "Final voice verification," she said. "Initiate full system emergency protocol." The room froze. Lights began flashing on the walls, their glow casting shadows. Across the officers' faces, the screen lit up with a new message. All present flagged for unsecured exposure to key voice. Await debrief. The courtroom doors locked with a loud click. An aide in the back, her clipboard trembling in her hands, let out a choked laugh. "This is insane," she said, her voice cracking. "She's got us all trapped in her little game." Her words were meant to rally the room, but they fell flat. The officers around her shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the flashing red lights. Marissa didn't respond. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze landing on a small window where the sunlight streamed in, catching the dust in the air. She tilted her head, as if listening to something far away, and her fingers brushed the edge of her blouse, smoothing a wrinkle with deliberate care. The aide's laugh died, her clipboard slipping to the floor. Panic rippled through the room. The colonel's face went white. He reached for his phone, but a security officer grabbed it from his hand. The congressman stood up, his suit jacket wrinkled, and tried to push toward the door. "This is outrageous," he shouted, but nobody listened. The captain sank into her chair, her hands covering her face. The young soldier looked at the private, his voice trembling. "Are we allowed to leave?" he asked. The private shook his head, his eyes locked on Marissa. She didn't look back. She turned and walked toward the exit, 2 agents in black suits flanking her, their faces unreadable. The judge sat back, his gavel forgotten on the bench. "All I wanted was for her to speak louder," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never thought she'd make the entire room fall silent." The screen flickered one last time, displaying a list of names. Every officer, every panel member, every person who'd spoken against her. They were all logged as unauthorized exposure to the key voice protocol. The consequences were already rolling out. The colonel's phone buzzed with a message from his commanding officer. His security clearance was revoked, effective immediately. The captain's name hit a classified watch list, her career frozen before the day was out. The congressman's face appeared on a breaking news alert that evening, his ties to a shady defense contractor exposed online. A woman in the gallery, her designer purse clutched tightly, stood up and shouted, "You can't just walk away." The voice was shrill, her face red with indignation. "What's an explanation?" The room turned to her, some nodding, others glaring. Marissa paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders straightened, and she tilted her head just enough to catch the woman's reflection in the glass. "I owe you nothing," she said, her voice soft, but sharp like a blade hidden in silk. The woman sat down, her purse slipping to the floor, her hands shaking. The agents flanking Marissa didn't move, but their presence seemed to grow, filling the space around her. Marissa didn't stay to watch. She walked out of the courtroom, her worn shoes silent on the marble floor. The agents stayed close, their hands on their earpieces, their eyes scanning the hallway. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The room she left behind was unraveling, each person grappling with the weight of their own words. The young soldier sat frozen, his hands shaking. He had laughed at her, called her a scapegoat. Now he couldn't stop staring at the screen where his name blinked in red. The private next to him whispered, "She wasn't just logistics, was she?" The soldier shook his head, his voice gone. Outside, the sirens had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like a storm was coming. Marissa stepped into the sunlight, her blouse catching the breeze. She paused for a moment, her eyes closing as the warmth hit her face. A black car pulled up, its engine quiet but powerful. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, his suit plain but perfectly fitted, his face calm but unreadable. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The agents stepped back, their hands dropping to their sides. The man walked to Marissa and stood beside her, his presence shifting the air around them. Nobody in the crowd outside dared to speak. They knew who he was. Her husband, the kind of man whose name didn't need to be said. The congressman, still inside, saw them through the window. His phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. The captain looked away, her hands still. Covering her face, the colonel stared at his revoked clearance notice, his jaw tight. The judge sat alone at his bench, the envelope still in his hand, its wax seals broken and scattered. Marissa didn't turn back to see any of it. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. The truth was out, and it was heavy. She slid into the car, her husband following. The door closed with a soft click, and the car pulled away, leaving the courthouse behind. The fallout kept coming. The captain's name trended online for all the wrong reasons. Her smug comments from the courtroom leaked by an anonymous source. The congressman lost his biggest donor by morning, his career crumbling under the weight of a single news cycle. The colonel was reassigned to a desk job in a nowhere base, his medals meaningless now. The young soldier and the private faced a different kind of consequence. Weeks of debriefs, their every word from that day dissected by men in suits who never smiled. They had laughed at her, judged her, dismissed her.
Oh, they couldn't stop seeing her face.
Marissa didn't celebrate. She didn't post about it online or call a friend to gloat. Went home to a small apartment with mismatched furniture and a view of a quiet street She set her bag on the counter, the same worn bag she'd carried into the courtroom. Her husband poured her a glass of water, his movements slow and careful. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and for a moment they just stood there, the silence between them warm and safe. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a hero. She was just Marissa, a woman who'd carried a secret heavier than most could imagine. The world kept turning, but for those in that courtroom, nothing was the same. They'd seen something they couldn't unsee. They'd heard a voice they couldn't forget, and Marissa. She kept walking, her steps steady, her head high, not because she'd won, but because she'd survived. She'd stood in a room full of people who thought they knew her and shown them they didn't, not with anger, but with tears, just with the truth, spoken softly, like a whisper that could stop the world. To everyone watching Thread Tales, know this: you've been judged unfairly too. You've been laughed at, dismissed, told you don't belong. But you're still here, you're still standing, and that's enough.
Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, hit that like button, and subscribe to Thread Tales for more stories that remind you of your strength.